Hi, good morning, everyone. This presentation is Classroom Management, a Behavior Analysis Level System, and this is all about Level 1 Antecedent Interventions. So before I go over our learning objectives, I wanted to mention that this presentation is part one of a three-part series on the classroom management system that we have created. And this level is all about antecedent interventions, or the things that we put in place ahead of time to make it more likely that students are successful. In this webinar, we will define antecedent interventions, understand when and why antecedent interventions are necessary, learn how to determine which antecedent strategies to use, and go over a few commonly used effective strategies, including environmental modification, visuals, behavioral momentum, and non-contingent reinforcement. Antecedent strategies in behavior analysis refer to proactive measures taken in the classroom to prevent challenging behaviors before they happen. And I really want to emphasize the word before. These strategies focus on modifying the environment or changing the way tasks and activities are presented in order to promote positive behavior. So instead of waiting for a behavior to occur and then responding to it, we're setting things up in advance so that students are more likely to be successful from the start. And this idea is supported in behavior analysis research. So if we can identify the relationship between environmental events and a behavior, we can change that relationship and reduce the likelihood of the behavior happening again. So in simpler terms, if we understand what's causing a behavior, we can adjust those conditions and prevent it moving forward. But why do we use antecedent interventions and what are their benefits? So first, they provide a preventive approach by allowing us to create an environment that minimizes triggers for problem behaviors. So instead of constantly reacting, we're reducing how often those behaviors even come up in the first place. They also promote positive behaviors by setting up an environment in a way that supports and encourages appropriate actions. For example, giving clear instructions or structuring activities so students know exactly what is expected of them. In addition, they enhance learning by creating a well-structured environment with clear expectations and supports, like visuals, which can help students stay focused and engaged instead of becoming distracted or overwhelmed. These strategies also reduce stress because predictable routines and supportive environments help students feel more secure. When students know what's coming next, they're less likely to feel anxious or act out. And finally, antecedent strategies are flexible. They can be tailored to meet the specific needs of each student, whether that means adjusting the level of support, incorporating their interests, or accounting for their individual challenges. For antecedent strategies to actually work, we have to start with one key piece, which is understanding the function of the behavior. So in other words, we need to know what the student is gaining or avoiding when that behavior is occurring. Are they trying to get attention, escape a task, access an item or an activity, or is it somehow fulfilling a sensory need for them? Because when we understand that, then we can make intentional changes to the environment that actually address the root cause and not just the behavior itself. So if the function of the behavior is unknown, we can't just start guessing. We need a structured way to figure this out. And that's where a five-step approach comes in, which helps us better understand the problem behavior and the purpose it's serving for the student. We conduct interviews, collect data, identify the behaviors and functions, and then we decide on which strategies to use. So gathering information is a key piece to this puzzle. We conduct interviews with the people who know the student best, that being teachers, paraprofessionals, administrative staff, and parents, so that we can understand what they're seeing across different settings and situations. We also review any existing records and then move into direct observations and data collection. So one common tool that we use is ABC data, which I'm sure you guys have heard about, which stands for antecedent behavior and consequence. This helps us identify patterns. What's happening before the behavior? What does the behavior look like? And what happens after? Next, we clearly define the target behavior. And this is a really important step because that definition has to be observable and measurable. So instead of something vague like the student was disrespectful, we would have to define exactly what that looks like, such as talking back, refusing to follow directions, or using inappropriate language so that everybody is on the same page. Any person that reads that behavioral definition and walks into the room should be able to identify it. So from there, we hypothesize the function or the purpose that behavior is serving the student. This could be attention, access to items or activities, escape from demands, or what we call automatic reinforcement, also known as sensory. And once we understand both the triggers and the function of a behavior, that's when we can develop effective antecedent strategies. So for example, we might modify the environment, adjust how we present the demands, or reinforce appropriate replacement behaviors so that we're preventing the behavior instead of just reacting to it. Let's start looking at some evidence-based antecedent interventions. So first, we're going to look at environmental modifications. These are the changes we make to the classroom environment to decrease or prevent challenging behaviors while also promoting appropriate behavior. The goal here is to set up the space in a way that naturally supports success before issues even arise. So some simple examples of this can include removing distracting items, adjusting seating arrangements, or modifying materials to better fit the student's needs. These might seem like really small changes, but they can have a huge impact on how students respond in the classroom. To give a real-world example, there was a study conducted in 2022 that looked at how seating arrangements could reduce challenging behaviors, specifically out-of-seat behavior. And in this study, students who frequently left their seats were moved farther away from the door, which reduced the opportunity for them to leave the classroom. We also know this as elopement. At the same time, the staff were positioned closer to the students who were less engaged, which allowed for more immediate support and increased interaction. As a result, they saw an increase in student engagement with both staff and learning materials, along with a decrease in out-of-seat behavior across the classrooms. So this is a great example of how making intentional, proactive changes to the environment can significantly impact behavior without needing to rely on reactive strategies. This is all preventive. Another really effective type of environmental modification is the use of visuals. And we all know about this, but especially for students with autism. Visuals are essentially concrete cues that give students information about an activity, a routine, or what is expected of them, and they can also support skill development. One of the reasons visuals are so powerful is because many students are strong visual learners and they may not respond as well to verbal instructions alone. So instead of just telling a student what to do, we are showing them, which can make expectations much clearer and easier to follow. Visuals can also be used to offer choices, which is really important. When students feel like they have some level of control, they're often more willing to cooperate. For example, using symbol exchange, a student can use a card to request an item or activity, which builds communication and reduces frustration. We can also use strategies like the Premack principle or the first then approach or granny rule, where a student sees first and they have to complete a task and then access to preferred an activity. And this helps with motivation and task completion. In addition, visuals can be used for daily schedules, which outline routines and help students know what to expect next. This can make transitions much smoother and reduce anxiety. And for more complex tasks, we can use something like a task analysis, which breaks down a skill into smaller, manageable steps, like all the steps involved in washing their hands. There are many types of visual supports, but the key is that they should always be tailored to the specific needs of the student and the classroom. So we've already talked about many ways to modify the environment to promote positive behavior, but now we're going to shift into strategies that involve how educators interact with students. One of these strategies is called behavioral momentum, and it might sound confusing at first, but it's actually really simple and powerful. Behavioral momentum is when we give a series of easy, high probability requests right before presenting a more challenging request. The goal is to build momentum with success so the student is more likely to comply with the harder task. A helpful way to think about this is like physical momentum. When something's already in motion, it tends to keep moving. In the same way, when a student is already saying yes and being successful with easier tasks, they're more likely to continue that pattern with a more difficult one. We call these easy tasks high probability requests, things the student is very likely to do, and the more challenging task is the low probability request. So how do we actually implement this? First, we choose about 2 to 5 simple tasks that the student can already do and typically complies in, things like clap your hands or give me a high five. And then we present those high probability requests quickly, one after the other, and provide praise after each correct response. And then right after that, we present the more challenging low probability request, like sit down or go to your desk. There's actually strong research supporting this. In one study, they worked with a student who showed very high levels of non-compliance. Before using this strategy, compliance was as low as 0 to 13%. But after introducing behavioral momentum, using the sequence of high probability requests followed by a low probability request, compliance increased to about 70 to 90%. So this is a really powerful example of how those small changes in how we deliver the instruction can have a huge impact on the student's behavior. Now we're going to talk about non-contingent reinforcement. And this is also a really powerful antecedent strategy. And the key idea here is that the reinforcement is provided independent of the student's behavior. So unlike what we typically think of with reinforcement, where the student has to do something to earn that reinforcement, with non-contingent reinforcement, we're delivering that reinforcement on a set schedule, regardless of what the student is doing at the moment. This can be done on a fixed schedule, where reinforcement is delivered at consistent time intervals, or on a variable schedule, where it's delivered around an average amount of time to make it less predictable for the student. So the reason this works is because we're essentially removing the need for that problem behavior. If the student is engaging in the behavior to get something like attention, a break, or access to an item, access to an activity, and we start providing that before the behavior happens, then the behavior becomes less necessary and less likely to occur. So instead of waiting for the student to act out to get their needs met, we are proactively meeting those needs ahead of time. For example, let's say a teacher notices that when students are working independently, they tend to start talking and acting out after 10 minutes to get attention. With non-contingent reinforcement, instead of her waiting for that behavior to happen, she provides attention every 5 minutes on average, regardless of what the students are doing. So because the students are already receiving attention regularly, they are less likely to engage in disruptive behavior to get it. And as the behavior improves, the teacher can gradually increase the time between attention, fading the support over time. Another example would be with students who tend to escape tasks. If we notice that students can typically work for about 8 minutes before becoming frustrated and disengaging, we can implement non-contingent reinforcement by providing a short break every 4 minutes. Again, this is regardless of what the students are doing. We might even use a visual timer so the students know when the next break is coming. Because the break is already built in, the students feel less of a need to escape the task, and they're more likely to stay engaged. So to wrap up, we focused on antecedent interventions as proactive strategies we can use in the classroom to prevent challenging behaviors before they happen. The goal of these strategies is to reduce or eliminate the need for students to engage in problem behaviors in the first place, while creating a more positive and supportive learning environment. We also talked about the importance of understanding the function of behavior and using a structured 5-step process to guide our decision making so that the strategies we choose are actually effective and meaningful for each student. And finally, we went over several commonly used antecedent strategies, including environmental modifications, visual supports, behavioral momentum, and non-contingent reinforcement, and how they can be implemented in practical classroom-based ways. So overall, the takeaway is that small intentional changes made before a behavior occurs can have a significant impact on student success and classroom management. These are my references.